Welcome and thank you for standing by. Today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Participants are in a listen-only mode until the question and answer portion of today's conference. At that time, you may press star 1 on your phone to ask a question. I would now like to turn the conference over to your host, Brian Beams. Thank you. You may begin.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Beams. I am an international trade specialist with the U.S. Commercial Service. I am your co-host for today's webinar. Joining us is the other co-host and my colleague, Anthony Sargis. Anthony sits in the Connecticut U.S. Commercial Service office. On behalf of the U.S. Commercial Service, the Connecticut, New Jersey, San Diego, and Imperial District Export Councils, and our speakers for today, Steel Root and the Law Office of Shipman and Goodwin, we welcome all of you to today's webinar titled Exporter Readiness Requirements for CMMC NIST. A couple of items to note before we get started. Be sure you are connected using both your telephone and the online WebEx platform, which enables you to view the presentation. All telephone lines are currently on mute. We will open the lines up for questions at the end of the presentation. We will also take questions submitted through the chat Q&A features on the WebEx platform. Our web address has changed. Please note that all U.S. Commercial Service information can now be found on www.trade.gov. That's www.trade.gov. I'd like to take a minute to inform the audience about the U.S. Commercial Service. We are the trade and investment arm of your federal government. We are the division within the the International Trade Administration. Our mission is to promote U.S. exports, protect U.S. commercial interests abroad, and facilitate foreign direct investment into the United States. We have offices all around the world. Domestically, we have 108 offices nationwide. Internationally, our offices are located within the U.S. embassies and consulates in over 75 countries. Here is the list of our remaining webinars for this 10-part series. Note all 10 webinars are being recorded and presentations will be forwarded to you every Friday morning, no later than 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I now like to introduce today's speaker. Our first speaker is Ryan Hayden. Ryan is a co-founder and managing partner at Steel Root, where he leads the firm's cybersecurity practice. Ryan's expertise includes helping exporters and government contractors implement and organize and operationalize cybersecurity requirements under ITAR, DFARS, and the DoD's new CMMC program. Ryan teaches cybersecurity at Endicott College and serves on the board of directors of the National Defense Industrial Association's New England chapter. Prior to founding Steel Root, Ryan held various roles in IT operations and systems engineering. He is a frequent presenter on the subjects related to cybersecurity, compliance, and data privacy. Ryan holds an MS in Informational Technology from the Van Loan School at Endicott College and a BA in Political Studies from Gordon College. Our second speaker is a returning guest, Alfredo Fernandez. Alfredo focuses his practice at the intersection of international trade and national security issues, with a particular emphasis on the aerospace and defense industries. His cybersecurity practice includes assisting clients on compliance with contractual requirements and regulatory standards, such as the NIST basic safeguarding requirements for federal contractors, and developing systems, security plans, and plans of action and milestones. Alfredo's compliance practice also covers assessments for internal and external risks to intellectual property and export-controlled information. As needed, Alfredo guides clients through breach and crisis response, as well as drafting voluntary disclosures of identified violations. Without further ado, I welcome Ryan. Ryan?
Brian, thank you so much for that, and good afternoon or good morning to everyone, depending on where you're dialing in from. I know that we just got introduced, but just to flash a picture of our smiling faces up on the screen, looking forward to this presentation today where we're going to focus on CMMC. Hopefully many of you on the call have had some exposure to the CMMC program. If you have not, don't worry, we're going to talk about the basics, but if you have been tuned into this new program, you may have seen there have been a lot of webinars and other content out there explaining the basics of the program. We have a lot of good strategy to share with you today, so we're going to start today's session by giving an overview of the CMMC program, launching right into some rule changes that may affect your business. So I want to start and maybe just set the scene for you a little bit. As the introduction noted, I work a lot with defense contractors, and there is a lot of overlap between the export community and the government contractor community, and that's why we're here today. So for those of you who handle data under ITAR, you're probably already aware of some of the cybersecurity requirements for companies that work on a DoD supply chain. You may be subject to DFARS and may have some familiarity with the CMMC program already. But if not, this is still very relevant content for you, as we'll share in the presentation today. This new program from the DoD really stands in as a bellwether for cybersecurity requirements that we expect to have a wide effect across exporters and government contractors in the coming years. If you've been following along at home, 2020 has been quite a year in more ways than one, but certainly a sea change for cybersecurity. So if you've been following the rules, there have been a lot of changes that have been proposed and implemented, such as the ones you see on the screen today. We're going to talk about all of these in more detail today, and I'm really thrilled to be participating here with Alfredo and to get his perspective on some of these changes. I have been starting most of my presentations for the last year with this slide. Now, the DoD keeps using this statistic of $600 billion in global losses due to cybercrime, and that's across all industries. It really affects all industries, and the problem sets are similar. There's a skills shortage when it comes to cybersecurity. Cybersecurity and IT are historically in many industries under-resourced, dealing with a lot of what we call technical debt or old technical problems that need to be resolved or that open up vulnerabilities for an organization. And also the fact that in cybersecurity, the adversary or the attacker always has an advantage. We're always playing catch-up or defense against the latest hacking techniques. Our adversaries have been leveraging this against American industry to a dramatic effect. And over the past few years, the DoD has said, enough is enough. We need to tackle this head on. So I'm going to just give you a quick history on what's happened in the last couple of years so that you understand where the CMMC is coming from. This is the DoD CIO, Dana Deasy, providing testimony before the U.S. Senate in January 2019. And they have identified this problem of American intellectual property funded by the Department of Defense that just goes out the door to our adversaries like China. They have identified this for a long time as a supply chain issue. And they understand that it's not necessarily the large prime contractors that many of us are familiar with that have these cybersecurity issues, but it's really an issue of the small businesses that make up the majority of the DoD supply chain. The further you go down the supply chain, the more prevalent these attacks are, and the weaker the cybersecurity infrastructure is. 2020 is really becoming the year of action with sweeping rule changes and new programs to validate cybersecurity and compliance up and down the supply chain. We've gotten a lot of good information and data from industry that also provides an indication of the state of things on the ground. The chart that you see over on the left, this was a great study that looked at NIST 800-171 implementation. So this is that list of 110 security requirements that companies who are subject to DFARS must implement. And they looked at implementation across industry by business size. And the results were pretty interesting. Basically, 0 companies were 100% compliant. And on average, companies fully implemented only 39% of those 110 security requirements. So this is interesting to me because even though large companies performed better, there was statistically little difference in compliance percentages between a company with $10 million in annual revenue and one with $100 million. And then in July of last year, the DoD Inspector General's Office released a report that came up with some complementary findings. Basically, they looked at 9 randomly selected contractors and found deficiencies across the board in basic cybersecurity categories like using strong passwords or multi-factor authentication and locking computers after inactivity, things that are typically considered fairly low-hanging fruit. So the state of things on the ground, just to sum it up, was that these cybersecurity requirements have been in contracts for a number of years now, but really we were not seeing full implementation to the degree that would make a difference when it comes to defending this valuable intellectual property. So a little bit of history here too on how agencies and prime contractors have been validating their supply chains. And if you're a company that has been subject to DFARS, you're probably familiar with this process. Essentially, you have language in your contract. That's the DFARS 252, 204, 7012 clause that says you will implement these 110 security requirements. You will come up with a plan that states how you will do it. And for any deficiencies that you have not addressed, you'll have a clear plan of action and milestones that indicate how you're going to get this stuff done. But to date, the issue has been that contractors self-attest to their own compliance, basically saying, I'm compliant because I say I'm compliant, without a real consistent methodology for the assessment or validation of compliance. So as these last couple slides have shown, this has not resulted in the level of security that's necessary to protect this sensitive information or controlled unclassified information, including ITAR data on contractors' information systems.
Hey, everybody, Ryan, I'll jump in. This is Alfredo Fernandez speaking, and I'll be speaking a little more later in the hour. But what jumps out to me with this slide on the left, the bar graph, is the highest kind of dark navy color on the left in the biggest company, third there, showing that the biggest companies are the ones taking this the most seriously, and at that 57, roughly 60% level, whereas the rest of their supply chains, that's a 3 in the middle and on the right side of that graph, are kind of just split between kind of doing it and kind of not. And as the CMMC process begins to unroll, a lot of those big companies that are taking this very seriously are going to start being a little more forceful with their supply chain to catch up. So it's an insightful graph. I'm glad Ryan was able to pull that out, but it kind of sums up where we've seen it as industry monitors, the realities of where things stand right now.
That's a great insight, and thanks for that, Alfredo. Jump in anytime. We'll try to keep this conversational. I know I'm going to lay some foundational information here, but please feel free to speak over me if you've got good things to add, and we can pass it off in that way. So those are great insights. So CMMC is the subject of our conversation today, or the focus. It stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And over on the right, you'll see Ms. Katie Arrington, who's the Chief Information Security Officer for the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. And she has really been the spokesperson for the CMMC rollout, which we've known about now for over a year. Version 1 of the CMMC was officially released January 31st of this year. And the bullets over here on the left will provide just a high-level summary of what CMMC is and what it's intended to be. Really, you could think of it as the teeth or enforcement mechanism for the DFARS clause. So many of us may have the DFARS clause in our contract and have been compliant in that we have created those system security plans and plans of action. CMMC comes in and says you're going to be audited and certified at a particular level so we can validate that you are doing the things that you say you're doing. Now, CMMC contains 5 different maturity levels, which we'll go into more detail here in just a moment. Essentially, what's going to be required here is that contractors will have to attain certification at a given level in order to win new business and new contracts. And again, we'll go into that in more detail. But another thing that's different about CMMC is that in addition to the security requirements, or as CMMC calls them, practices, these are things like implement multi-factor authentication, for example. In addition to these security requirements, CMMC is also a measure of process. So that's the M, or the first M, I suppose, in the CMMC. It's measuring the maturity of your cybersecurity program. So it's not necessarily good enough to say, yeah, we checked that box because we have that security control. CMMC assessors will be looking at how is cybersecurity managed across your organization. Do you have a plan? Are those plans well resourced? Do you have the appropriate staffing to be keeping up with the daily rigor of protecting your networks and sensitive data from cyber threats? It will be a go, no-go requirement on all DoD contracts, and we'll go into more detail on the timeline. DoD has stated that this is going to be a phased approach starting fall of this year, with a full implementation, meaning every single DoD contract contains the CMMC requirement by 2025. Alfredo, any thoughts here on CMMC before we proceed?
Sure. Just for those who are maybe getting hit with this for the first time, or at least sitting down to listen with a clear mind here, it kind of boils down to a report card where you'll get a level 1 through 5, and we'll explain that in future slides. But the crux of it is most of the defense contracts will have a minimum requirement for your maturity level. If you have it, you can continue in the bidding process. If you don't, you are categorically barred from going any further. So this is a very serious regulatory framework going forward for those companies that rely on government contracts, whether directly with the government or through the supply chain.
Absolutely. There's a lot of data here on this slide, and I apologize for the overload. I'll attempt to describe what's going on here. So there are 17 what they call domains in CMMC version 1. DoD has stated that this program will continue to evolve. So just when you thought you had checked off all the right boxes, just like cybersecurity, threats are not static and they change, so will CMMC adjust to the day's current threats. So that's an open question in terms of how frequently is this program going to change, how frequently do I need to be certified. So some of these questions have yet to be answered, and industry certainly has a lot of questions about what to expect. But if you have had DFARS in your contracts in the past, you are likely very familiar with the security requirements or practices that are required under CMMC. So CMMC, and I have a comparison slide coming up here next, adds to the security requirements in NIST 800-171, and it also has some new requirements. So spread within these 5 levels of CMMC certification are varying numbers of cybersecurity practices, as well as the processes by which those practices are managed. And each level corresponds to a different number of practices that you are expected to have 100% implemented in your environment, and different maturity processes on how you manage cybersecurity for your organization. So the simple way to think about it is like this. If you do business with the DoD in any form, if you're on any type of DoD supply chain, you will need to have at least CMMC level 1 certification. And thankfully, that is not a super high bar. It's similar requirements to what's required under the FAR, basic safeguarding requirements, and I think it's 20 different practices or so that are required for basic IT and cybersecurity management. If you are holding controlled unclassified information, of which ITAR data is a subcategory, you're going to need level 3 certification at least. And level 3 is the level of CMMC that most closely matches the existing requirements under the DFARS 7012 clause, and that is the full implementation of NIST 800-171. CMMC adds an additional 20 practices to that and also looks at how are you managing cybersecurity across your organization. Beyond level 3, levels 4 and 5 are reserved for organizations that are working on more sensitive contracts. So these are security practices and processes that are aimed at really trying to keep out APTs, or advanced persistent threats. These are those nation-state funded, well-resourced, highly organized adversaries that are targeting you specifically. So whereas level 1 through 3 might be considered what they're calling basic cyber hygiene or good cyber hygiene, basically keeping up with best practices in cybersecurity. It's those levels 4 and 5 that are really focused on more proactive defense of their networks. So there's quite a big jump from level 1 to level 3, and similarly from level 3 up the chain. The prevailing wisdom at this point has been, if you know you handle controlled unclassified information on your networks or as part of a contract, most likely you're going to need level 3 certification. We have heard from the DoD that they expect that less than 0.5% of contracts are going to require levels 4 through 5, but again, that remains to be seen.
So, Ryan, with recognizing that the contracts that are going to require the highest levels 4 and 5 are a very, very small percentage of overall defense contracts, and a lot of our clients and probably folks on the phone have that DFARS 7012 clause already in their existing contracts and expect to have them going forward. Understanding whether CUI exists, and again, that's controlled unclassified information, exists in their system, and kind of predicting whether they'll be dealing with contracts requiring level 1, level 2 is kind of a throwaway, and really level 3. What's your read from a technical perspective of what's the most likely outcome there in terms of understanding your CUI risk and predicting what kind of maturity level you'll have to reach to keep the status quo with future contracts?
It's a great question because Ms. Arrington has been going around on her speaking tour saying that she expects that most DoD contractors are only going to need level 1 certification. That's a big disconnect from what those of us in industry expect. For those of us who have been working with aerospace and defense companies, manufacturers, exporters, suppliers who hold this type of data, I expect that most organizations are going to need level 3 certification if they are handling CUI. And that would have to be a whole nother webinar to talk about what is CUI, how do you know if you have it. I think anyone who's been subject to DFARS has probably experienced the frustration of not knowing what CUI is under a contract. The DoD and other agencies, it's been a very slow roll to get them to properly mark and document data as such. I think we will be seeing a change in that process soon. I may have gotten off on a bit of a tangent here, but I know that's a frequent question that comes up. I expect that a lot of orgs are going to need level 3 certification, but I say that with the caveat that DoD is expecting that most orgs will need level 1. A lot of text here on this slide too, so we will circulate these slides. We don't need to read bullet by bullet, but this is a breakdown of the differences between the different levels. Level 1, again, corresponds to existing requirements under the FAR 52-204-21 to protect federal contract information, or FCI, and then it scales up. So again, we've said level 3 kind of correlates to organizations that need to protect CUI, or controlled unclassified information, and the levels beyond that correspond to more proactive processes that are aimed at a more sophisticated attacker or threat.
Ryan, could you elaborate on that term FCI? You mentioned federal contract information. What an example of that would look like?
Yeah, great question. And, I did not frequently know this term until CMMC came about, even though the definition has existed for a while in the FAR. So federal contract information, or FCI, is information that's not intended for public release, that's either provided to a contractor or generated by the contractor for the federal government under a contract, or in the provision of delivering a product or service to the government. So that's pretty general, but it's essentially non-public information generated on any federal contract, not necessarily just for defense contractars. It is a lower level of sensitivity than CUI or controlled unclassified information. NARA maintains the CUI registry, and all federal agencies are in the process of adopting the CUI program, which does have more clear definitions on what is CUI. But just one example of that, export controlled data is a type of CUI. So there are many classes of this information that's not classified, but still has very specific safeguarding and dissemination requirements. Again, I think part of the process in industry successfully adopting some of these requirements is increased understanding of what this data is and how to identify it. One thing that's interesting to me here and that warrants being pointed out here is when we're talking about getting a particular level of CMMC certification, you're going to have a third-party assessor come in and essentially do an audit to certify that you're doing the things that you should be doing. At level 1, your processes are not even assessed. So all you have to do is prove that you have implemented those practices. So for everyone concerned about the rigor of these assessments, level 1 I expect will be a pretty easy bar for most organizations to meet. I'm not too concerned about that for most of the organizations that I work with. But as we go up the chain, obviously, as the requirements change, so will the rigor of the assessment in order to be certified. Alfredo, as you look at these different levels, what thoughts or questions come to mind for you?
One is, Ryan, the potential changes in the required levels as the supply chain goes from big company to smaller supply chain company at various levels. So say, for example, in Northrop Grumman, contracting directly with the government requires a 3, but not every supplier, I'd imagine, is going to also be held to that level 3. So, probably more likely most of the Northrop vendors will be either a 3 or a 1, depending on the, what they do for Northrop, but I'm just using that company as a national brand example. What have you been seeing about that kind of vendor or supplier step down in terms of expected maturity level for a given contract that may have a higher level at the top?
I am dying to know what the official mechanics are going to be here. The DoD has clearly stated that if a prime contractor does have let's say a CMMC level 3 requirement, they don't necessarily need to flow that same level of requirement down to all of their suppliers. The DoD recognizes that that's not a realistic way that supply chains work. You might have a supplier playing some subcontract role on a contract that doesn't need that level of requirement. So we know it's not going to have to flow down all the way down the supply chain. That said, I don't know exactly the mechanics by which a prime contractor will be required to basically attest to their supply chain's cybersecurity and CMMC level. I do know that the DoD has said that they are very much looking at ways for organizations to stop a practice of oversharing on a contract. So If I've got the schematics for a fighter jet and I'm a prime contractor playing some key role on that contract, I don't necessarily need to provide those schematics to every single subcontractor and supplier that's maybe producing work under the contract as a subcontractor. So the process of redacting information, the process of only sharing required information is certainly a key consideration.
And this is a bit of a speculative question just from your judgment. In terms of the sequence of federal contracting with requests for information, requests for proposals, working out the actual bids, and then signing a contract at some point to kick it all off in the first phase, at what point is the government expected to communicate the CMMC level that will be required of the prime?
So that will actually be specified in the RFP. DoD has said that'll be in sections L and M of an RFP. So it'll state which CMMC certification level is required to bid on the contract. One big asterisk there is in this phased rollout, in this first phase especially, CMMC certification will be required at the time of award, not at the time of bid. And that's just a logistical necessity. As they stand up the program, we don't have these assessors yet. And the DoD says that they plan to work very closely with these first contracts that contain CMMC to make sure that it gets rolled out smoothly and learn some lessons there. All right. So for organizations that are already familiar with DFARS requirements and the requirement to implement NIST SP 800-171, what's the big difference here between NIST 800-171 and CMMC Level 3? Well, CMMC Level 3 is going to add 20 new practices or 20 new security requirements. And the biggest difference here is that under DFARS 7012 to date and NIST 800-171, you were considered implemented or compliant so long as you had a system security plan that says, hey, even if we haven't fully implemented all of these cybersecurity requirements, we know that we have these deficiencies and we have a plan to remediate them. Not so under CMMC. You are expected to have full 100% audit defensible implementation of all these cybersecurity requirements, or you're not going to be certified. And on top of that, and in my mind and in my experience working with industry, this is a major change too. You need to demonstrate process maturity and not just have a box checking exercise that says, yeah, we purchased this software, or we require this security feature. It needs to show how you're doing it. What is the internal or external team that's managing cybersecurity for your organization? What are your policies? How are they enforced? And what are the procedures by which you are managing some of these ongoing requirements for cybersecurity?
So in terms of that audit requirement at some point, not today, we've been told that there's going to be a CMMC accreditation board to essentially train and approve the assessors all over the country. And those assessors would be the ones that come in, do the audit, and slap you with a number 1 through 5. What kind of, where does that accreditation board process stand now? It's, obviously in its infancy of the idea to have something like this, but what's the latest there?
A great question. Probably what everyone on the call is most interested in hearing is, when is this going to affect me? How much time do I have to prepare? Alfredo and I had a slide in here from DoD that showed their anticipated timeline. They've circulated several timelines over the past year, and for the most part have tracked pretty closely to them. We didn't include it on here just because it's kind of a difficult to understand or read. So just to discuss it conversationally, that the CMMC accreditation body, or AB, exists. They received their memo of understanding from the DoD in March. They have been working in earnest since the beginning of this year. It's a nonprofit organization of volunteers through industry, academia, et cetera. They anticipate opening registration for these third-party assessors, or what they call C3 PAOs, later this week, actually. So we have seen some of the information leaked in recent weeks on what these requirements are going to be for assessors. Not to go too far down the rabbit hole, but DoD has clearly said throughout the whole COVID-19 crisis that the show goes on. A lot of the process that's in motion right now are regulatory changes. So there are changes to the DFARS 7012 rule that we'll review here in a second. Those are still proceeding. So the plan is this fall, there will be a small number of contracts that are going to include the CMMC requirement, but it's going to be a phased approach, and they've said full implementation is not expected till 2025, which frankly is great news for contractors. Many of the organizations I work with still have a long way to go in full implementation of their requirements under DFARS and now CMMC. So I think that we're probably a little ways off from seeing CMMC requirements hit, most contracts, but at the same time, it really takes some time to get ready.
Now, I think the most important takeaway is that the accreditation body missed a great opportunity by coming up with a term, C3PAO instead of C3PO. But I think that the A was important in there, so they couldn't nail it, but what can you do?
There's a lot of Star Wars fans in the cybersecurity world for sure. So with that background and realizing we're 37 minutes in now to this webinar, I want to share some strategies and start to talk a little more practically and concretely about what this means for organizations. And my number one thing here is that this is a budget wake-up call. I have here in my notes a 2017 study by Deloitte indicated that IT budget as a percentage of revenue for highly regulated industries can top 7%, which is over twice the average of other industries. Now, to put that in context, if we look at manufacturing, for example, manufacturing was averaging less than 2% of revenue on IT spend, which to me says that a lot of small businesses in the defense industrial base are probably underspending on IT and cybersecurity and have been doing so for a while, even with the DFARS requirements in their contracts. So the fact that you now have to have a third party come in and audit you and be certified in order to win new business, that's huge. And I think it's going to require some systemic change, especially a lot of smaller firms that don't have a mature cybersecurity practice. So one way I like to help organizations think about this is obviously as a government contractor, you have a lot of financial and accounting requirements as well. Cybersecurity needs to be viewed in 2020 for any industry as a discipline or a department that your company has. Just like you would need a finance department or an HR department, cybersecurity should be managed as a core part of your business. It's not a utility and it's not a box checking exercise. Another thing that I like to point out is that, and this hasn't always been the case, but IT, cybersecurity, and compliance are now three really distinct skill sets. Having an IT guy doesn't necessarily help you meet the cybersecurity and compliance requirements that are pretty rigorous these days. So understanding that those are different skill sets and often require dedicated personnel and teams to manage those different practices and responsibilities could be a wake-up call for a lot of organizations as well. One thing that I like to point – oh, sorry, Alfredo, do you have something to add there?
Sorry, while you were talking there on budget, I was thinking, oftentimes the government as a customer will allow some quote-unquote allowable costs as part of the expenses of a contract. What's the discussion been on some cybersecurity enhancement type expenses being quote-unquote the allowable costs for federal contracts?
Yeah, I know. I don't know that I'm qualified to speak to that. I've heard differing opinions from differing sources, and the message from DoD is that security has always been an allowable cost. Obviously, that looks a lot different depending on the nature of the contract. So, I don't expect that DoD is going to pay the bill for implementing cybersecurity at your organization. There may be ways that you could price in some of these requirements into your bids, but it actually brings up an interesting point, which is that especially in these early few years of CMMC, having CMMC certification is going to be a competitive advantage for the organizations that can successfully meet these requirements and obtain their certification. If they're, first among their peers to get that certification, especially in the early years here of CMMC rollout, that's going to be a huge differentiator. But in terms of what allowable cost means, I can't speak to that with a high degree of confidence.
Thank you.
One thing I will say, just to kind of put this in everyone's head, and this is the third bullet here, I think scope limiting exercises are the name of the game for most organizations who are going to meet these requirements today. And here's what I mean by that. If you've got these 130 cybersecurity practices for CMMC Level 3, there is a huge difference in terms of cost and required resources as to whether you apply all of those security requirements to your whole company or to just perhaps one business unit, or even to narrow even further, maybe just a couple systems where you're going to limit the flow of controlled unclassified information. This is absolutely fair play to apply cybersecurity to a subset of systems, so long as you have a very mature and documented process for how controlled unclassified information flows in your organization and how you can keep it to just that secure environment. So one term that's used in cybersecurity compliance a lot is an enclave. So building systems to meet those security requirements within just a subset of your information systems may be one of the most cost-effective things that a lot of organizations can do. One strategy that you can consider in light of that recommendation is, I think there's a strong use case for organizations to apply the CMMC Level 1 requirements across the entire company. These are some basic common sense things like run antivirus software on your computer. But perhaps only apply the full rigor of CMMC Level 3 requirements to just a subset of systems or users that will have to interact with controlled unclassified information. Obviously, this isn't going to work for every single company. It's really going to depend on the nature of your business, but especially for organizations who are looking at this saying, man, only 10% of my revenue comes from DoD contracts. Limiting the scope is really going to be key. Beyond that, documentation and process maturity is huge and an area that I see a lot of contractors sorely lacking in. So again, remember, CMMC is going to measure that, and that's going to have to be an area of focus. And lastly, this is specifically for CMMC Level 3 and above, being adequately resourced is a requirement. And what that means is personnel, tools, et cetera, DoD expects to see, and the assessors will likely have some way to measure whether you're investing enough in cybersecurity maturity or if it's just been a check-the-box exercise in the past. Alfred, I'm going to pass it to you here to weigh in on some of the legal implications and what you see coming down the pike that folks should be aware of.
Sure. Thank you, Ryan, and good job laying out some of the background and the basics and getting into some of the technical business considerations. My pivot here is the legal considerations for all of this happening in the years, really months and years to come. From a legal perspective, your federal contracts and the supply chain contracts and purchase orders, et cetera, are contracts and they're subject to breaches. You want to be aware of some potential risks for you breaching your own contracts that can obviously lead to some trouble, and to be aware of where your customers and suppliers may be breaching the contracts that end up hurting you. So to summarize those bullets without getting into too many of the weeds, I've just organized them into 3 groups. One is your government contract. If you are in a position where you're contracting directly with the government, you are signing up to a lot of fine print as to what the terms and conditions of that particular bid and award contract involve. And in many cases, the representations you may be signing are maybe more broad and robust than you realize. So understanding when you say, I can meet all those NIST safeguarding requirements as required by the DFARS, that 7012 clause we referenced earlier. If you can, good. But if you can't, there's a risk there, and we anticipate some other kind of business-centric certifications for CMMC in future contracts that fully envelop the CMMC once it's been fully incorporated by the DFARS. So that is a potential contract risk for you that you want to be sure you're comfortable signing. Similarly, if you're not in direct privity with the U.S. government and you're working with a prime contractor who is, or you're a couple levels removed from the supply chain, you have a deal with your customer that says, I'll provide you X widgets or this kind of service for this many dollars under this time frame. If you haven't seen it now, you probably will start seeing some kind of cybersecurity requirements, whether it's a representation that you can meet the NIST 800-171 requirements, you are this CMMC level, et cetera. There are some, what your customers start choosing to use in their contracts going forward once CMMC really gets rolling in earnest remains to be seen, but that should be something your business development and legal folks should be looking at just to make sure you're not in violation before the ink is dry on that contract. And turning it around on your own supply chain, who you're buying from, there may be some requirements imposed on you that require you to kick the tires on your own suppliers at an appropriate level. And chances are it would probably be kind of a level 1 requirement. That isn't necessarily a huge undertaking, but understanding your own context of what you're pushing down to your suppliers could be a step that's worthwhile to protect your own company as this gets rolling out, and start working with your own suppliers to understand what may be coming down in the next year or so. So those are, on the contract side. And a little bit more on the juicier side, because contracts are only so exciting. The litigation angle, I think, is a lot better for TV. This example I put in that first bullet on this slide here, you have a plaintiff, maybe they're an employee, maybe they're completely unrelated to your company, but they bring a suit because you, as the company, had a data breach, and they were injured with some kind of legitimate injury and are bringing a claim for damages. And let's presume all that's fair. You currently have some files potentially that have some indication of your cybersecurity health and all your IT systems and your what you've done to take care of the data that you hold, whether it's health information or personal identifying information or ITAR or EAR controlled information, whatever, the CUI term we've used, SCI, whatever it may be that got out that shouldn't have gotten out. You may have some files that clearly document where your weaknesses are, or the fact that you don't have any reports can be a problem to show you were negligent in understanding where you were. And why that matters is because in a litigation setting, the parties have an opportunity to exchange documents. This is called discovery, as long as it's related to the case and not privileged. And that this plaintiff could ask for any kind of cybersecurity assessment reports. If they ask for that today, would you be comfortable with what you have to give up? And particularly unique to this discussion is that once the CMMC kicks into place and you have your accreditation body, assessor come by and do your full audit, a report will be issued. That report is going to show the good, bad, and ugly. You meet these 64 requirements, you whiffed on these 37, and these other 18 were kind of gray. That's a document that shows some warts. And even though the CMMC accreditation may be completely unrelated to a breach type lawsuit, they could absolutely use that to their advantage in a litigation setting, and picture your chief information officer or information security officer in a deposition and having to answer, hey, a professional told you were way underperforming in these 38 things, and what did you do about it in the year and a half or 2 years that followed? Nothing. And then, boom, my breach happened, and I got injured, and time to pay up. It's an uncomfortable vision for anybody. So the fact that CMMC will be producing some kind of report that will be in your file and potentially subject to discovery in this kind of scenario should raise some flags that your house in order so that the report you do get back from the assessor is at least and Ryan, you can move on to the next slide there, please. So in terms of preparing to get a flattering report, or as flattering as your budget allows, when the CMMC kind of formal assessment happens, let's say 2021, 2022 timeframe, you want to have a good understanding of what your system would actually score ahead of time. So one of our highest recommendations is a self-assessment to be performed before you really have to go do it with the CCMC formalities, so that you have an understanding of where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, and the opportunity to correct those weaknesses before the formal CMMC requirement comes along. One of the other recommendations that goes hand in hand with that is that a privileged self-assessment can be very useful. Documents that are produced by a lawyer to help protect or to help the client receive legal advice can benefit from the attorney-client privilege, and that means in a discovery type scenario like that litigation example I mentioned, you'd be able to refuse handing over a privileged report. So if it's an unflattering document, you can have some privilege on it and act on it, so by the time the CMMC report comes around, it's improved, and if you have to disclose that report, because there would be no privilege on that one, you would have already had the opportunity to clean up your house a little bit. So in that plain black box in the upper right side of that screen was a little video to introduce another concept in relation to the self-assessment, and it ties to the title of this slide, and is better than or. And by that we mean working with counsel and a consultant is better than working with counsel or a consultant. There's very little overlap in the services, and by working legal and technical, we provide a legal and technical solution for a legal and technical challenge there. So to summarize the commercial, it's a little clip of a commercial that you would have seen if the WebEx system we were using allowed video play, which we learned 10 minutes before our presentation here that it did not. It's a little funny vignette where a couple is driving in a Ford Focus, and they're talking about the car features, driver assist and power roof, whatever, and they say better and than or, and then they cut to the same couple eating at a Chinese restaurant and says, I prefer sweet and sour chicken as opposed to sweet or sour chicken. And anyway, I'm not doing justice to the video. The video says 1,000 words, but in the link we'll send around with the presentation, it's a cute little 10-second video. But anyway, so you can remember, sour chicken when you're talking about self-assessments and working with the counsel and a consultant to come up with a plan. The counsel engaged the consultant underprivileged as a kind of a sub-vendor, and then the consultant is an extension of the lawyer that informs the legal advice, and we are able to keep most, if not all, of that kind of draft report information under the privileged, So just in case you get into a scenario where you have to disclose some documents, you have the option to, to defend, not having to disclose it if you don't need to. So depending on the business, it may not be for everybody, but a lot of our clients choose to implement that strategy, and it has paid off from a business protection perspective. I think that's all I'll hit on that slide, conscious of time.
Yeah, it makes sense. A lot of our clients will have us work through counsel for that very reason. I mean, you have to prepare for audit, which means that you have to take a look at your own dirty laundry, but to codify that and put it in a report form when you're not sure that you're going to have the budget to action on all of it, it makes sense to build in some protections where you can. Kind of a sick joke, but sometimes when I'm working with like an IT person or a contracts person and they're having trouble fighting for budget, for example, I just say, well, why don't we find out who goes to jail at your organization under the False Claims Act? We'll get them on the phone and then have this conversation. And I don't mean to make light of things, but there are serious implications for not being in compliance, obviously, and organizations would do well to be mindful of those things. Speaking of mindfulness, mindful of the time that we have left on the call here, we do have several slides left, and obviously in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of them. They do have some links where you can get some more information, so we'll certainly circulate all of this as well as our contact information. Along the lines of a self-assessment, as we wait for those assessment guidelines from the CMMC accreditation body, everyone agrees the place that you should be looking, it's that second bullet on here, NIST SP 800-171A. It's an assessment guide for measuring yourself against those 110 requirements in 800-171. Just to breeze through, there are some updates to ITAR. Alfredo, do you want to give us the Cliff's Notes here in our last couple minutes?
Yeah, this will be the 15-second version, which this was kind of more of a bonus topic anyway, but given the overlap in the audience, that recently just, I was going to say last month, but it's already June, and this was March. ITAR, the Department of State, amended the rules, so they have explicitly carved out transmission of data that's encrypted from start to finish, even if it's sent overseas, wouldn't count as an export. So it matches what the EAR has had for years, but it is a noteworthy update on the ITAR, particularly when kind of evaluating how to use potentially foreign cloud services or shared cloud with a foreign affiliate, et cetera. This provides some flexibility in terms of how you can do it without running afoul of the ITAR. If this is a topic of interest for anybody, that can be reached offline to discuss in detail.
Absolutely. It's a welcome change that opens up some new technical options for protecting that data. I will say end-to-end encryption is easier said than done. If you're not sure what end-to-end encryption is, you do well to research that before making any changes to how you protect ITAR data. Coming soon to a FAR near you, controlled unclassified information has been making its way through process, and we expect that the FAR, just like DFARS, will adopt requirements for protecting this data too. There is a DFARS rule change to incorporate the CMMC program and just a lot of other fun stuff going on. Provided some more resources here in a final slide. I will leave this up here because it has Alfredo's contact information as well as mine. We'd be happy to talk with you offline. I meant to leave some time in here for Q&A. I apologize that we didn't make that happen, but I know we'd both be very happy to answer your questions offline as well. And with that, Tony, I will pass it to you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Alfredo. We're going to take a question or two, and then I'll give you guys a second to take a peek in that Q&A box while Sarah, the operator, is going to prompt us for questions. So we'll let Sarah give the instructions, and then we'll take a question or two.
Thank you. If you would like to ask a question, please press *1 from your phone and unmute your line. Speak your name clearly when prompted. To withdraw your question, press *2. Again, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1 and unmute your line. Stand by for questions on the phone.
Thank you, Sarah. Alfredo, do you see the question in the Q&A box? I can read it for you if you don't see it.
I don't. It shows me 0.
Yeah, I'll just read this for you. So level 4 or 5, we are managing a CUI and ITAR. I understand level 3 is minimum. However, we are working with the FBI counterintelligence to protect commercial aviation data when in a project in China and Russia. Will this cause a higher level 4 or 5 to be certified? That's pretty specific.
I can take that one. Yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer definitively, and I don't think anyone does because we don't know which contracts those requirements are going to apply to, but my gut tells me level 3 is going to be adequate there. My understanding of level 4 and level 5, again, we're expecting less than 0.5% of DoD contracts. A lot of this, I think, is going to be, heavily involved in nuclear programs, in missile defense, those types of projects. So I can't say with any degree of certainty what level you're going to need, but as you indicated, definitely a minimum of level 3.
Thank you, Ryan. Sarah, do we have any questions?
We have no questions over the phone.
I'm going to ask one question that I just came up with. As far as the assessments, is that public information? If you have an assessment done, is that publicly shared?
There will be a database where certification levels are maintained such that they can be queried to make sure that a contractor does possess the correct certification level, but that will not be public information. One question I have, and I don't know the answer to this, is how will a prime contractor know what level its subs are certified at? And I think some of these mechanics are still being worked out at this time.
All right. Thank you, Ryan. Sarah, last call for questions.
We have no questions.
All right, guys.
I do see one in the chat that I can just answer quickly. I see one in the chat that says, for level 3, are external audits required annually? Great question. At this time, we anticipate that it's going to be a 3-year renewal period, so you'll have your certification for 3 years.
All right. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Alfredo, again for participating in today's webinar. This was number 8 out of 10. We'll be back Thursday for the FCPA webinar. If anyone has any questions, again, we will send a copy of the recording out in the presentation Friday morning by 9 a.m. So we've been doing that on a weekly basis. We'll also make sure that video that Alfredo was explaining is shared as well. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Take care.
Thanks.
And thank you for your participation. You may disconnect at this time.